Today is May 15th, 2008. I am Cassie Potasic, and it is a pleasure to conduct this interview for the Dakota Memories Oral History Project in Eureka, South Dakota. Can you please tell me your full name?
Robert Reinhold Gab.
When and where were you born?
I was born November 14th, 1926 at the farm home where I grew up and lived for 80 years.
Have you ever heard an interesting story about your birth?
No, I haven't. I haven't heard anything about it. Don't know whether there were any complications or anything, not to my knowledge. The only thing I know is that my grandmother, I think, helped with the delivery, which was quite normal in those days. They didn't use doctors too often unless they had to.
Okay. Can you share some of your earliest memories with us?
Oh boy. The earliest probably were the dust storms, thunderstorms. My mother was very frightened with storms, and so she was always on the lookout for storms to come up. Some of your memories probably would go back to playtime with brothers and sisters, and I should say brothers mainly. I was 8 years old when my sister was born, but cousins in particularly, we'd get together and play games, and one of the favorite games we played was to sled down the hill in wintertime. You probably noticed when we were at the farm, we have quite a hill leading into the farm from the pasture. We'd use that for sleigh riding, and in the summer times we used that with the coaster wagon to come down the hill. And the challenge was to get to the bottom of the hill, get as close as you could to the barbed wire fence, and whoever get the closest would be the champion. My cousin got a little closer than he should have, went right under and took his cap right off. He laid back in the coaster wagon, and the shield on the cap got caught on the bottom wire and took it right off. Luckily, he had his nose down closer to the bottom of the wagon, so it was all right. The other incident I remember with the hill sledding was that there were 7 of us, I believe 6 or 7 of us, that were on one sled. We had a rather large sled, long sled, so the youngest would sit clear at the front and then on back, and then two of the kids would push the sled to start it down the hill and then kneel on the back end. Well, that one Sunday afternoon we came down the hill and a little too much weight and buried the sled at the bottom of the hill in the snow drift, and everybody piled on top of each other. And the youngest, I don't think he was more than 4 years old, he came up, wanted to cry, but everybody else was laughing, so he had to laugh too. But we thought we'd have to dig him out of the snowdrift. So those are a couple of things. There was always some tales about trapping gophers. I know one of the neighbor kids wanted to make extra money. He'd trap a gopher, cut the tail off, and release it, hoping it would grow another tail. So it didn't work out that way, but those are some of the things that I recall. Some of the other games we played, which our folks didn't condone if they caught us at it, was fox and goose on the roof of the buildings, on the lane 2 of the barn, with the corner of the roofs as bases, of course. So when you'd run fast to get to base, sometimes you couldn't stop and you'd have to leap off of the end of the roof. So those were some of the memories that I have to this time, but growing up. And nighttime games were usually tag or hide and go seek, and we had yard lights. And I grew up with electricity and never was without electricity, so we used the yard light pole as the home base, and so you had to get to that base for hide and go seek to be safe, and that was fun for us to be out in the dark, and we knew that we were all right with all the kids around. You know, to be out there alone, wouldn't have been out there, but with a bunch of kids, so it was all right. So, memories other than that, yeah, there's a lot of memories going to school. We would walk to school most of the time. It was a mile and a half to school. Winter times, Dad would take us with the sleigh probably the earlier days until we had better roads and used the cars. And when I was in 6th, 7th grade and 8th grade, probably rode a pony. Brother and I would double on a pony. We had Shetland ponies and do that to go back and forth to school. One of the memories that stand out is my dad had a team of horses that were very tame and knew the way back from school. So we'd take the team and the sled and drive to school, put the reins around the post and turn them in the right direction, and they would go home by themselves, go up to the barn and stop and wait for my dad to come and unhitch them. So that was kind of unique. Other than that, you know, the games in school were the usual fox and goose, ante over, and so on. We had one game, I can't even recall the name of it. It was, oh gosh, can't remember. Anyway, we had the door into the school, the front area was the home base, and two guys would be the aggressors, I guess, and we would challenge them by running out on the school ground. Well, one of my cousins took off at lunchtime. After lunch, we played that game, and he got out on the road, had a road right next to the school, and one of my other cousins went after him to try to catch him, and they didn't come back until recess time. They kept running until one of them was tired, and they'd call a truce and visit a while, and then pace off the distance between them and take off again. And it didn't get back until afternoon recess time, so we had a lot of fun about that for a long time. We still kid them about it now. So those are some of the things that I recall and probably embellish at times.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit more about your school. What was the composition of your class, of the students that went there?
Most of them were cousins. That was the area where the Gab families grew up, and so we had a few outsiders, but most of them were cousins. I'd say the majority of them probably had 2 or 3 students that weren't cousins. We had as many as 22 or 23 kids in school at one time, all eight grades. It was a one-room schoolhouse, but it was a very modern school compared to most schools. We had indoor plumbing. We didn't have electric lights, but we did have indoor plumbing, and we had a full basement. We had a furnace in the basement for heating, and so we were never too cold. If we were cold, we could stand over the furnace area. There was a grate in the floor where the heat would come up, and if anybody was really cold, they would stand or sit in that area to stay warm. But the indoor plumbing, we had one for girls and one for boys. They were separated and had the cloakroom, so it was, I guess, quite affluent compared to most schools of that era. We had a library, pretty extensive library. Our parents all believed in education, especially being they didn't have that much of an opportunity themselves for education. So they were quite adamant about getting education for their children. And so we, I think most of my cousins, if not all of them, were encouraged and did attend high school, and quite a few of them attended college too. Our country school stayed in operation until school reorganization really took hold in the area, and we opted to close the country school, and that must have been in the late 50s, I think, because I know we were married, and our kids, most of our kids went to country school until our oldest son was in the 8th grade when they started going to town school. Our youngest daughter did not go to, or two youngest daughters did not go to country school, but the other kids all went to country school to begin with. So, and they cherished it, I guess. It taught them, I think, taught them independency, and they learned a lot. The younger students learned a lot by listening to the older classes, being in the same room, for classes and so on. So, country school wasn't all that bad.
What subjects were you taught?
We were taught all the subjects that had in town school. I think, if I recall correctly, we must have had over the years at least 10 or 12 different subjects. From art and math, music to history and geography and language, English, whatever. Didn't have any problem as far as that goes when we went into high school. Myself, when I started high school, didn't have any problems that I felt inadequate to competing with the other kids education-wise. Probably more social. I was very bashful, I think, and likely coming from country school in my freshman year, I think there were only 2 people I knew in the whole freshman class to begin with, and one of them was my cousin that was in my same grade in country school, and another one was a former neighbor boy that had moved to town a few years earlier. So other than that, it was all strange to me. And what a huge school, to have, you could go to once when you come from a one-room school.
Okay. Did you have school programs for holidays or celebrations?
We did for Christmas. That was a tradition, the Christmas holiday and Christmas program that we all had to learn learn our parts and perform. It was a big thing. The parents would come and bring little barrels and the wood barrels and planks, and move the desks out of the way and line up seating, and we'd have a full crowd. And we had a curtain across the front of the room for us to be behind for to get ready. We used the girls' cloakroom for staging area too, get ready for the next act. And then of course always had to have food after the program, which was a big thing, and usually a fundraiser along with it for YCL or whatever cause. So yeah, it was enjoyable. I think kids nowadays have a lot more opportunities, but they miss out on a lot of things that we enjoyed that they probably never will be able to enjoy or understand, for that matter. The other big event was the ending of school with a picnic. That was a community affair, and ended up usually with food, of course, but first, before that, we'd have to have a softball or a baseball game with the kids challenging the parents. And I don't know if it was staged or not, but usually the students won. That's my recollection.
What kind of foods were brought to these events?
It was whatever, you know, it was whatever they bring, you know. It was a big lunch, I'm sure, you know. I don't recall specifically what they had, but I'm sure potato salads and ice cream. That was a mainstay. Didn't go without ice cream, and we still have that instilled in us, I guess. And I think my wife, who is not at all German, she's English French background, but I think she's learned to appreciate some of the German traditions, and so we have ice cream quite a bit. In fact, we have homemade ice cream now yet, where we have a freezer and apparatus that we make ice cream in the refrigerator. So we have homemade ice cream, and our people that visit us look forward to eating homemade ice cream. But that was one of the mainstays when neighbors and relatives would visit on the farm. Was always had to have ice cream. In fact, one of my cousins used to eat a soup bowl full of ice cream instead of just a dip or two. So,
Do you remember how the process for making ice cream when you were younger?
I remembered. I'd probably have a hard time doing it now, but yes, being my mother's maid, I could make ice cream, I could bake bread, I could bake cookies, and I could do anything, you know, anything that was done in the kitchen.
I have a couple more questions about your school. You mentioned a library.
Hmm.
Do you remember any of the books that were in the library?
We had an encyclopedia with it that was in the library, you know, and then of course we had Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, and some of those traditional ones, and then there were some classics. I don't recall the names, but I know there were some Shakespeare stories and some of those that most of us probably never opened the book or just opened it and made the teacher think we were reading them. Never did, but uh, we had a pretty sufficient library. It was built into one of the walls of the school, and so it was, I'd say, 4 to 6 feet wide, and the length of the, you know, the as tall as the wall, basically. So, and we had a set of maps, all the countries of the world. We uh, enjoyed that. I did enjoyed it, and we had a globe, a suspended globe, and I think it kind of tweaked my interest in geography, and I'm still interested. And I appreciate the opportunity to have that background, because anything that goes on in the world, I know exactly where it's happening, and uh, have a better understanding of why it's happening, I think, than some of the people that weren't interested in geography or history. So I really appreciate that.
All right. Can you tell me about your teachers?
I don't know that I had a favorite teacher. I think I liked school, always liked school, and I think I enjoyed all the teachers. We had some teachers one in particular that was married and lived in the basement of the school. We had one of them that lived in a trailer home on the schoolyard, so you know, we were exposed to teacher and spouse too. But most of the time, the teachers stayed with some of the families in the area. Usually, my uncle that lived closest to the school, my dad's oldest brother, who was only half a mile from the school, and that was more convenient for them. But I think I liked all of the teachers pretty well. I didn't get in too much trouble myself. I think I was too bashful to do anything outrageous. But other than that, I, I think we had fairly good teachers. Uh, some schools I know weren't so fortunate, but I think we always had good teachers. Some of the teachers I know that we had went on to be county superintendents or went on into teaching in city schools, so they had qualifications.
So if somebody did get in trouble in school, how were they disciplined?
Different means. Every teacher had different means. Of course, the one that I think most of them dreaded was to have to stay in at recess time, not be able to go out and play. We had one teacher that resorted to capital punishment almost. You know, he had used a stick or a strap that he brought from home or whatever. He had used it on one of my cousins too often, I guess, or too severely, and he went home and fixed himself a little hand pad with some tacks or something in it, and when the teacher put him across the knee, he whopped him on the side of his leg. And of course that didn't set too well, but as a result of that, the parents had discussion with the teacher and the strap disappeared. Wouldn't get away with that today, you know, that kind of punishment.
So what's your favorite memory from going to school?
Playtime. What else? Now, I always liked math, and as I mentioned before, geography and history always intrigued me. Probably one of my poorest subjects would have been English and literature. I, to this day, wished I would have done more reading, and I did go on. It's not that I didn't do my work. I was never in any problem. I think I probably was a B student or better all the time, but it was just I didn't enjoy that subject as much as the others. But I don't know, maybe as a result, I was a teacher myself prior to being married and going back to the farm, and several of our children were teachers. Some of my siblings were teachers, so education was quite high priority in our family.
All right. What did you take with you for lunch?
Haha. We would take our lunch along, of course, in a bucket, quite often a empty gallon syrup bucket, which was traditional in those days. But we did have lunch pails, and it was usually cold sandwiches. We didn't have any way of heating anything. Didn't have electricity at that time yet. But probably my least favorite lunch to take along were sardine sandwiches. I detested and still can't stand sardine sandwiches or sardines, period. But I did enjoy most of the other foods. My mother was pretty good in giving us tasty foods. If we did get to school with something that we didn't like, it was quite common to trade with somebody else. That there's one the students that usually brought 2 or 3 pieces of dessert cake or pie or something, and he had a bonanza in bargaining for whatever he wanted, because we could trade a sardine sandwich for a piece of cake. That was a real bargain for me. So.
All right. Is there anything else you want to tell us about grade school?
Oh, we did, yeah, I suppose it could. We had, like I said, quite a few students, so the school board saw to it that we had quite a few sleds. We did some sledding in the ditches on the ice especially. We had, one year, we had a path, actually a 2-lane path in the ditch, and nobody dared trespass. That come the wrong way. Well, one day one of them did come the wrong way, and the two sleds collided, and one of the kids lost most of his upper teeth, where the sled came up over the top of his sled and slammed him in the face. So, but we did have fun. We later on in probably my upper grades, 7th and 8th grade, we had a contest in the spring as to who could get the closest to the thawed out part of the ditch. And my cousin went in under the ice with the sled and consequently had to stand on the furnace to get dried out. So, but it was fun at the time. We also quite often played games on the road, last couple out and stuff like that, or track races, especially in the spring before we had the county events. We would practice and run and so on. So I think we had a lot of fun. We probably were more creative than kids nowadays who can sit and watch television instead of going outside and playing. But we always had fox and goose field and played baseball or softball, whatever. So it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it.
All right. Now you've mentioned your siblings and your cousins quite a bit. Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Well, they were all German. I don't know. I guess I've mentioned before that some of my favorite cousins were the closer ones, but we all had the same background, I guess, and all had pretty much the same upbringing, whether whether we were close or not. So we had a lot of fun together, and I don't know what I could add to it that would be different from what I've said about my immediate siblings. Most of them did go on to school, high school, and so on, and it was just with the same background. We went to the same school, basically, and the same church, so we were together really all our lives, basically, until we went to college or got out on our own and separated that way.
Okay. Then can you tell me the birth order of your siblings?
The names?
Yep.
Okay, Aaron was no, let me back up. Viola was the earliest, who only lived 2 months. And next was Aaron, and he died in 2000. Next would be Harold, who lives in Anoka, Minnesota. And I was the 4th child. Then my sister was born, Ardella, and she's married to Lloyd Ernst, and they live in Gainesville, Maryland. They lived in Bismarck. Well, they lived all over Brookings to begin with, and then Huron and Bismarck, and then Cheyenne. He was with Basin Electric, so they moved around quite a bit. Then they moved to D.C. area. He was with Western Fuels in D.C., and now they're retired and living west of D.C. area. And so I don't get to see her very much. Then our youngest is Delbert, call him Del. He was the spoiled one, we say, but as young ones are always blamed to be. He lives in Dickinson now, and he was a teacher before he went into private business. He was a professor at Dickinson College before he went into private business. My sister was a nurse, still works for the hospital in her area. My other 2 brothers, Harold and Aaron, were both teachers, and I taught before I went back to the farm. So, like I said before, education was a high priority.
How did you all get along when you were growing up?
Real good, except on occasion. We just recall one Sunday afternoon, Harold and I wanted to play baseball, and Aaron wanted to read. He loved reading, and so he was going to get out of our hair. We were pestering him and didn't let him read. He went from one room to the other in our house, and he finally climbed the silo, clear to the top, the peak of the silo on the outside and up to the peak of the roof, so he could read. He thought he had us beat when we started throwing rocks at him, which wasn't the best thing to do. But, so I suppose he didn't think we were getting along very well at that time. But most of the time we got along fairly well. We played together and worked together. We have our fights, of course, what siblings don't. But we had a lot of fun together too. We'd play games. We challenged each other quite often. I know one time we see who could walk the furthest distance on the top of a corral board. Now, you try that sometime if you think you can balance real good on a 3/4-inch board and walk on top of that and see how far you can get without straddling it or falling off. Well, so that was fun, and we also tried to do rafting on the local potholes. Harold didn't think too much of that. He thought it was useless, that a couple of logs and a couple of planks wouldn't float very well. Aaron and I were determined to do that, but Harold wanted to try swimming or learning to swim and dive, so he had his fun. And of course along came my cousins, and so they helped with that, either diving into the mud or thinking they would learn how to swim, but it didn't work that way. But most of the time we got along pretty well. We had to get along, or Mother and Dad would see to it that we reconciled.
And so how did your parents discipline you?
Mother usually referred us to Dad. Occasionally she would, we get some punishment, and the yardstick or something like that was never too far away, and we knew it. But most of the time it was just a talking to, told us to shape up or else, and we knew what or else meant. So.
All right. Which one of your siblings were you closest to?
My Harold, my brother, just a year and a half older than I am. We were closer, in high school we were closer. Aaron was a couple of years older than that, so he was out on his own, so we were closer that way. Later on, after marriage probably, or after Harold was out on his own, went to college and so on, and I was quite close to both my sister and my youngest brother. But I don't think there was any way of being favorites. And after I got back to the farm, my oldest brother Aaron also had gone back to farm, and then we farmed together for many years. So we were always close to each other. We still get together annually. We have some land in estate that we own together, and we have our annual meeting to get together and visit and have fun together. And so I guess we were always quite close.
All right. Did any one of your siblings have a nickname?
We were in high school. We were all Gabbies. Other than that, not too much of nicknames that I can recall. We had names for each other at times, but not for publication. But basically, names were just a different version of Gab. So I know that's the only way I was recognized with my classmates or my buddies in high school was Gabi on the high school team, and that's what I was. Never called me very often. I should say not very often that I was called Bob, and more so in last years here after with my involvement in conservation, more people call me Bob now. Not very many call me Gabi now, but I guess that was a teenage thing.
All right. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about your siblings?
Well, I don't know. I think I mentioned all of them, went on to school, and they were all teachers, or sister was a nurse. So other than that, I don't know of anything else that comes to mind right now.
Okay. And we'll move on a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about your daily life out on the farm. Can you tell me what the inside of your house was like when you were growing up?
We had electricity, of course, as I mentioned that before. It was always clean. We had, we did have electricity, but we didn't have electric stove. We had gas refrigerator. We had a bottle gas refrigerator, I'd say, and the stove was the old black wood coal and corn cob stove, whatever. That stove brings back some memories. We're not only gathering corn cobs to start fire, but we had to, in the 30s, when everything was scarce, we would walk the pastures and pile up cow chips and then have to haul them home and use those for fuel too. We had a furnace, a coal and wood furnace in the basement, and with hot air. My dad would go West River to the coal fields to get a load of coal once or twice a year. At times he would go over to the river to get logs for the stove too. But other than that, it was just the kitchen stove that we fired up. The furnace was basically for nighttime, I guess. And other than that, it was two-room house originally. When my folks moved into that house, they added an addition to the south end of the house, which served as an entry and a bedroom. Then they finished the upstairs, which was two more bedrooms, and that's where we grew up. In the wintertime, usually we would sleep, in the cold days, we'd sleep on the pull-out sofa, which was in the living room, which was warmer than the upstairs. It was quite cool at times. I recall in the really cold times that the cover would stick to the frost on the wall. There was no insulation, so the frost would form on the walls on the inside during the really cold days. Some of the recollections of living in that home probably were the holidays, Easter and Christmas. I know Christmas was a big thing, still is for the children, and we were no different. We couldn't wait for Santa Claus to come. I recall one year when we were kind of reluctant to go to bed Christmas Eve after the church program, came home, and of course we were excited Santa Claus would be coming. Well, we heard a roar, and Dad said, "You better get to bed. That's Santa. He's coming with an airplane this year." This was, modern times for us. So, of course, we hustled to bed. Well, the next morning when we got up and got outside, we had a radio with an overhead aerial, wire aerial, that was on the ground. So we were wondering what happened to that. And my dad said, well, that's when Santa flew over and you guys weren't in bed, didn't he? Got caught on the wire and tore it off. Well, we bought the whole story until we got to church on the next morning, on Christmas Day then, and heard the people talking about the dew on the wires and the damage it caused tearing wires down. So we questioned Dad about that. Of course, he got a chuckle out of that, but it got us to bed. And Easter, of course, the Easter Bunny had to come, so my dad had a hired man who was just a real card in pulling jokes, and so this one, he ended up being an uncle. He married my mother's sister, and we laughed about it quite often afterwards, that one Easter evening we went to bed, and the next morning we got up. Of course, the Easter baskets were in the living room, but there was a big black streak on the floor, and there were little pebbles on the floor. And of course, his explanation was that the Easter Bunny slipped and fell and deposited more than he should have. But we found out later that it was a hoax. But he got a joke out of it. So.
Okay. Since we're talking about holidays, what else do you remember about Christmas, about how you celebrated it?
Church services, of course, and usually a three-day service, not just Christmas Day. We had second Christmas and third Christmas, and it was always church service, and usually no work except for doing your absolute necessary chores. The same held true at Easter time or some of the other church holidays, Ascension Day, and any of the other church holidays. They were all very, very sacred and were held in this high esteem. And always food. Christmas time and prior to Christmas, there was always goodies around, be it nuts or candy and cookies, and anybody that visited couldn't go home until we had lunch, of course, and that was true for all the holidays.
Did you get gifts?
Did I what?
What kind of gifts did you get?
Necessary gifts, clothes mainly. If we were lucky, each get one toy. And later on, in the late 30s and so on, then it was more so. But during the dirty 30s, it was pretty tough going, and of course we understood. And when you don't get more, the less I guess you appreciate what you do get. So it wasn't a matter of being disappointed. It was just, we understood that it was a matter of need. When Dad went to town, he'd probably scrounge up some money and bring home a candy or two for each of us, and so we appreciated that too. So.
Did you have a Christmas tree?
Definitely. We always had Christmas tree decorated, fully decorated with different things, and always had candles on there, but always had to be very careful. We couldn't play too close to the Christmas tree when it was lit, because we had our instructions to stay away from it. But what I recall was the smell, the Christmas trees with the original, not the artificial ones that most people have nowadays, and the aroma. The house was full of the aroma of a Christmas tree, and it was something we looked forward to.
Did you make your own decorations for the tree?
Some, but most of them were carried over from one year to the other. So we knew, we had the regular ornamental decorations and the ribbons and whatever else, different things. But the candles were the highlight.
Right. Then can you tell me a little bit more about Easter?
Well, I don't know what to say about Easter, except that we had. It wasn't just Easter; it was all the holidays before that. There was Maundy Thursday, Ash Wednesday, and it was basically a week-long holiday. So, when we were teenagers, of course, we looked forward to that. It meant less work, but not realizing that we had to make up for it afterwards. But at the time, it was all right. But most of the time, it was a full week holiday, starting with Ash Wednesday and going through to the first Easter Sunday and then Easter Monday and Easter Tuesday. So it was a full week. And of course, all the visiting that was done and so on, that was Easter for us.
Were there any special foods served?
No, not in particular. Kuchen was always there, of course. But I don't recall, there definitely no meat on Good Friday. Usually it was noodles and prunes or something of that nature. But other than that, there wasn't too much tradition for any particular food. Not to my recollection, anyway.
Okay. Did you celebrate the 4th of July?
Oh yes, that was the summer event. We'd usually go town for 4th of July celebration. I don't know that we took part in the foot races, but we usually take in the carnivals or street entertainment and whatever else, Traditional 4th of July events.
Can you describe the carnivals or the street entertainment?
Well, they always had merry-go-round, which was a favorite, and all of the other rides. Later on, of course, they came with more sophisticated rides with the swings and so on. But prior to that, it was Ferris wheel and merry-go-round were the main things, and that's, I think, probably what we were most inclined to take part in.
Okay. Is there anything else you remember about the 4th of July?
Horse races, maybe. There were several people in the area that loved their horses and had horse races. In fact, not only on the 4th of July, but in our immediate area that I grew up in, we had one neighbor that was very proud of horses and he had some pretty good running horses, and so we'd always have some outsider come and challenge, and we'd have races out on the dirt road or gravel road, and half-mile races where they'd have a start, and of course the finish line is where most of the people gathered to see who would come in first, and invariably his horse would be the winner, because it was a good horse, there was no doubt about it. And so that was always fun to go to that. That was usually a Sunday afternoon event.
All right. Did you celebrate other holidays like Valentine's Day or Halloween?
Yeah, we didn't really celebrate them. It was just an event. It was more a school event, Valentine's Day and Halloween, than at home. Just exchanging Valentines and Halloween. I don't recall, we decorated the school for that, but I don't recall that we decorated the homes or had any particular home celebration for Halloween.
Right.
Thanksgiving was a different story, that was a bigger event. for us as far as food is concerned. That's usually goose, duck, or turkey, and all the trimmings and everything else that went with it. So Thanksgiving was one of the major holidays as far as food is concerned, and again, a church service, without doubt.
Now, when your family celebrated holidays, did your extended family come to visit?
Not just the extended family, of course, were right in the neighborhood. So, yeah, they would visit, probably take turns. One year they'd visit this one, and the next year the next one would have to host, and so on. But basically, they didn't all get together at the same time, at the same place. One or two of the siblings, my dad's siblings, would get together, and then next time they would go to visit somebody else. So that was most of the entertainment in the between families, was to visit each other and just visit and talk, and sometimes they'd play some games. I know my folks, my dad had a horseshoe game that they played in the basement, and then with the furnace that we had in the basement, my dad would make popcorn and so on. So they had quite a bit of fun that way. They had their different teams to beat each other and whatever. So it was quite a lot of fun.
Did your family also celebrate birthdays?
Definitely. Probably not extravagantly, but yeah, we usually had a birthday cake and a gift or two. I don't recall that we exchanged gifts between my siblings. It was usually just the family gift to the birthday recipient. Yeah. And what sometimes I mentioned Aunt Katie as one of my favorite aunts. They would come to celebrate my birthday. I remember that. Or a lot of times the sponsors, baptismal sponsors, would give you a gift in church prior to your birthday or shortly after. So that was basically the extent of birthday celebrations.
Do you remember any of the gifts you received?
Probably a Bible story book or something like that was more in line, or something that you could wear, a shirt or something. And those times it wasn't extravagant. It was something that you could use. And if it was a game, it was a game that family could play, so that everybody would take part in it. So it was your gift, but really you shared it with everybody.
All right. Is there anything else you remember about celebrations when you were growing up?
Not in particular, no. I think that covers it pretty well.
All right. What kinds of things did you do for entertainment when you were growing up?
Family games were always in vogue. We would sit around the table after supper and play games, dominoes and checkers and so on. Chinese checkers, liked to play that. The radio was quite a highlight. My folks were one of the first, if not the first, in the area that had a radio, being we had 32-volt electrical system. So whenever there was anything of significance on the radio, we would listen to that. And of course everybody had to be quiet because the reception at times wasn't the best. So we had to be real quiet, and my Aunt Katie and her family would come especially for boxing matches. Joe Louis was their favorite, I guess, so they didn't miss any of those. They would come in, and of course the living room was full of people, and it was quite a challenge for everybody to be quiet so that you could hear the announcer describing the boxing match. So that was one of the big events always. One of the other things that we did for entertainment, that was one of my uncles that loved to catch sparrows in the evening. After dark, we'd go out into the buildings, and of course we had lights in there. We'd switch the lights on to see if there were sparrows up in the lofts, and if there were, we'd turn the lights off and then use the flashlights to knock them down or catch them, and so he enjoyed that. One time we were catching sparrows in the hog barn, and my dad always had boards laying across the top of the first floor, for the not the total ceiling but partial, and my uncle was up there catching sparrows, and my dad had the lid from a hog feeder, a tin lid up there too, and he thought it was a board and stepped on that and came on down. It just folded between the joists and down he came. I don't remember if he got the sparrow or not, but we sure got a charge out of it. And so that was, we had all kinds of fun. We were very creative in our entertainment and so on. There was no card playing with the religious background that my family and my dad's siblings had. Card playing was taboo, and going to dances was taboo too. So we had to create our own entertainment, which was more, family type entertainment. So if anybody in the neighborhood could play guitar or harmonica, that was an entertainment. They would play and the people would get together and sing. And so one of the incident that I recall, not just the immediate family, brothers and I would play hide and go seek in the house in the evenings, and of course 4 rooms, you didn't have too many places to hide, but my dad always helped us hide. Well, my brother wanted to hide under the kitchen cabinet, and couldn't quite get under, so somehow he did get under. But when my oldest brother then found him, he tried to get out and his head was stuck. He couldn't get out. My dad had to lift the cabinets for him to get out. And one time I recall too that I must have been quite small. Of course, I was very small for my age in a way at that time. But my dad put me on top of the clothes rack, about 6 feet off the floor, and covered me with clothes. Well, there was no way my brothers could find me until I giggled up there, and then they could find me. So, that was our daily life and our entertainment.
You mentioned earlier a baseball team?
Yep, we had, as teenagers, we had a local area baseball team. Aaron was the catcher. Harold, the brother, was one of the pitchers. We had other youngsters in the area that were quite good at pitching. But we had a full team, and we had some subs even left over with cousins and people in the neighborhood. We had our name Jackson Jackrabbits, being we lived in Jackson Township, and we had a lot of jackrabbits always, and we thought we were as quick and as fast as a jackrabbit, so we thought that was an appropriate name. We had that team for several years, and my brother, the oldest brother Aaron, was somewhat the manager, but parents helped with that. But we had the baseball diamond in our pasture that we used when we had visiting team come. Of course, if we played there, we had on Saturday afternoon, we'd have to clear the area so that we could slide into bases without getting soiled too badly. We would also travel as far as 15, 20 miles to play opposing teams. So we had quite an organization going for a time. And of course, we came by that honestly. It's my uncle was quite a baseball player. He had a regular baseball field on his yard. We passed the place that I mentioned where my grandfather stayed the first year that they were in the country. But he had a regular baseball team. I forget what they called that team. Sitley, I think is what they called him. But he was the catcher. Another uncle, several other uncles played on the team, and they were good enough to challenge any local town team. So we grew up with baseball in our blood, I guess. So we had fun playing baseball.
All right. Well, let's switch over a little bit and let's talk about food when you were growing up. Who did most of the cooking at your house?
My mother and I. uh, I helped quite a bit, but later on, when my sister was old enough to do some work, and when my older brothers were gone, then I had to be out in the field to help out there. Then mother was alone, or else she had a hired girl, neighboring girl, or somebody that would help her. But food, it was generally self-sufficiency at home. Butchered chickens. We once or twice a year, my dad would, with the help of neighbors, butcher a hog, and a lot of times a young beef, and they would process it right on the farm. My uncle and some of the other neighbors were very good at the technique of butchering and so on. I recall with the hogs, mother would have to heat quite a bit of water to scald them in a barrel, and they'd have block and tackle to lower the dead animal, after they kill the animal, lower them into the scalding water to be able to clean them and then hoist them back out. And then we would look forward to eating some of the fresh produce that they made, which was always good. It was always the German sausage, of course, and liver sausage, head cheese, and whatever else. So we had plenty of food, and kuchen, of course, kuchen and pie and cake were always staples that we had. We always had milk and eggs, so we're very self-sufficient that way. I've often wondered what families would do nowadays if in a crisis where we couldn't get to a store to buy food. We wouldn't know what to do. Probably resort to roadkill.
Did your family have a large garden?
Very large garden, yes. We had just a garden in the yard locally for the local vegetables. Then we always had up to an acre or more of potatoes and corn, sweet corn or popcorn a lot of times, out in the field that we would take care of. Spring of the year, Dad would plow while we would plant the potatoes in the furrow, and then, of course, the whole family would go out to pick bugs off of the potato plants or spray them with homemade whisks of grass or something, and wasn't really a chemical. It was a mixture of what they call Paris green in water, and that pretty well took care of the bugs, but it had to be done ever so often. So that was a full day job. And then hoeing potatoes. Can you imagine hoeing a half acre or acre of potatoes? And the corn my dad would cultivate with the single row horse cultivator, of course, and I got to do that myself later on in time. That was a challenge too, to have the horses go straight enough so you had corn left after you got done.
All right. What were some of your favorite foods growing up?
Uh, German sausage, pork sausage, definitely was one of the favorites. Mashed potatoes, unless I had to peel the potatoes myself first. But those were staples and were always favorite. Egg drop soup was another one that was usually a Sunday special. Uh, Chocolate pie, which is still one of my favorites today. So those were some of the favorites.
Did you have any least favorites?
Yeah, head cheese, liver sausage. Still don't care for them too much. Uh, and I mentioned earlier the fish, especially the sardines. I was never fond of that, but we didn't have that too often. So
Right.
hot dogs were always a favorite too, and that was a treat, later on, not in my earlier years, but probably when we were uh, later on in grade school is when folks would bring hot dogs home, so that was a favorite too.
Great. What was your family's attitude toward alcohol?
With the religious background, alcohol was not something that uh, wasn't anything that was in the house. I don't recall seeing alcohol outside of a half gallon of wine, maybe for butchering. They had wine uh, as an appetizer before a meal, but other than that, there was no alcohol basically in the house.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about food and preparing food when you were growing up?
I guess I remember having to knead the dough. That was something that I got to do as my mother's helper, and preparing the yeast and so on, and it got to where I could do all of that on my own, but. And then helping with making pies and kuchen too. I knew how to roll out the pie crusts and so on, and some of the cookies that I learned to make by myself, which I haven't done for a long time. Some of my cousins probably do more cooking now than I do. I did my share early on.
All right. Then let's talk just a little bit about the clothing you wore when you were growing up. Did you have store-bought clothes or homemade clothes?
Uh, some of both, but not too much. Myself, probably more hand-me-downs with the two older brothers. They outgrew them. Before they were outworn, clothes were handed down, and so there was quite a bit of that. So a new clothing item was a real treat, and that was probably Christmas or birthday, and looked forward to that. But I don't recall that we ever complained about it. Everybody else was in the same boat. One thing I do recall, if folks bought a new pair of overalls or something like that, quite often they'd buy one for each of us. I know one time my dad and mother came home from town, and we each had a cap. They were all alike, but we each had one. And so, in fact, we've had some pictures in the past. I don't know if they're still around. When I was about 6 years old, my folks made a trip to Washington to my aunt and uncle's place in 1932, and that was quite an undertaking to drive all that distance in a Model A Ford. And the picture showed that we all had the same coveralls. We're all alike. It looked like triplets, only different age. So evidently there was a feeling that they didn't want to show favoritism or wanted us younger ones to have something new too, instead of just hand-me-downs.
How about shoes? How often did you get new shoes?
Only when they were wore out. Shoes definitely were something that we had to wear out. It wasn't that you wanted a new pair of shoes that you'd get a new pair of shoes. As long as they had any wearability, you wore them. Only way to get out of them that is to wear them out totally or outgrow them.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about clothing or your daily life when you were growing up?
Well, I don't, right offhand, I can't think of anything. I'd have to look at my notes for that.
Right. Well then, what was your most stressful childhood memory?
Probably the dust storms and the heat with the grasshoppers and all that. It'd be too hot to be outside during the day. And I know a lot of times my dad would not be outside from noon until later, quite late in the afternoon, because it was just too unbearable to be out. And mostly he was concerned about the horses. You know, it was all horse equipment, and the horses would not have stood up under that kind of weather, so they waited until it was cooler and then worked later in the evening. A lot of times during the summer, heat of the summer months, we would actually move downstairs where we had our dinners and so on downstairs. The only thing we did up on first and second floor was the sleeping, but the food was downstairs. And of course that was Mother's chance to do the annual cleanup, any painting that needed to be done, and so on. So it served two purposes.
All right. What is your happiest childhood memory?
Boy, Christmas probably. Christmas and visiting neighbors and visiting relatives in the neighborhood. You know, those were always joyful times. But Christmas, I imagine, because of the looking forward to Santa Claus and the happy times in visiting and fun times that we had together with family and friends, that had to have been the happiest times. Along with that was the school program and the church program, which was the highlight always. So that had to be the happiest times.
Okay. What was the most adventurous thing you did as a child?
Wow. Probably walking to my grandma's place, which was about 2 miles by myself. I had to go through our pasture and my grandpa's pasture to get there. I loved to pack eggs. Maybe one of the reasons that why we had over 1,000 pullets when we got married and had the hatching flock and had to clean eggs. Each egg then had to be cleaned individually. But I loved to pack eggs. I don't know why. So I would ask my grandma to keep eggs until I get there to pack them. Of course, she couldn't do that because I wouldn't be there maybe once a week or once every other week. But that 2-mile walk through the pasture was quite an adventure with the cows around and a couple of strange bulls and so on. So that was quite an adventure. Probably one of my scariest times was I was preschool yet. My dad had sheep. He always had a flock of sheep, and we had quite a few coyotes around, still do. and of course, when the sheep had lambs, we had to bring them in to the barn and the corral every evening. So my dad would load 3 boys and go out had a Model A pickup and drop us off at the far ends of the pasture, and we had to bring the flocks in, and he would drive around and make sure that we had found all of the ewes so they didn't lamb somewhere by themselves. Well, this one evening, I happened to be stuck with a ewe that had a fresh lamb. He couldn't walk very fast yet, and so I was on my way home. My brothers were out ahead of me. They had the rest of the flock ran, and this one, of course, the little lamb couldn't run fast, so I was tail ending, and my dad came by, and it was getting dark already, and all I could determine that he said there was a coyote, and he was getting the shotgun. Of course, I was deadly scared, by myself. I thought, what would that coyote do when he'd come on to me with that little lamb and the ewe? And so I was mortified. Well, found out later that the coyote actually had caught himself in the barbed wire fence, and couldn't get off. My dad was in a hurry to get the shotgun before the coyote could get away. It didn't take time to tell me that, but I was sweating to get home. I probably was only 200 yards from the barn, but seemed like 200 miles to me.
All right. Is there anything else about your childhood you'd like to share with us?
I think there probably is more that I'll think of later on, but that's probably about it for now.
Why do you think it's important to tell your life story?
It's something that I think we had thought about for years, my wife and I, and that's one of the reasons that we did the family history book. It's something that I miss not having from my grandparents. I never got to know my paternal grandmother and grandfather, and my dad didn't talk too much about it. I just barely got to know my grandfather on my mother's father on her side of the family. I got to know my grandmother quite well. She was in our home quite often and stayed there during my sister's birth, and so she always helped my mother during summer months too, and of course we visited her more often, so I got to know her, but really have no memory to speak of my father's family that way, and I miss that, so we were determined to put something together, and I think it's great that you're pursuing to put the history together of all the German Russians. It's a rich heritage. I know we talk about Native Americans being so adamant about their heritage. A lot of times I wish that my ancestry or my German Russian people would be more adamant. Quite often, a lot of them are very reluctant to talk about their past, and I don't know, I don't know if it can be inherited, but I know my folks, and from what I heard, his folks were very reluctant to open up with anything their lives, probably because they were in Russia, and all the tribulations they faced there. They had to move from Germany to Russia and then had to flee there, and a lot of their relatives were left in Russia, were shipped to Siberia and so on. So there's a distrust of government, and actually a distrust of sharing your personal feelings in your personal life. It's something that I hadn't mentioned before. I did mention, I think, to you about the name change from GAB to GAUB, and actually in our research we found it was GAUPP in Germany. And my dad, we asked him how come his mother and his uncles had GAUB and he was GAB, and he said, well, when his dad came to the country and filed his land claims, the papers came back with GAB, and he was afraid that he'd not be able to legally get the land, and so he left it that way. That was incorrect. I don't know if his parents told him that, but in our research we found that on the ship roster his name was misspelled. And so my assumption is that he was afraid he would be deported. And on the citizenship, if he changed his name back, and he, I don't know what fear he had, but it must have been something to that effect. So he left it as was, and so maybe that is inherent just through the personality and so on, that it kind of is inherited in a way. I don't know. Maybe it's an excuse of being bashful, or two, I don't know which, but there could be a reason for it.
Right. Well, thank you so much for doing this with us.
Thank you.